Students of International Business 130, IBUS 130, welcome to my video lecture. I'm Professor Hyman, and I'm here today to talk to you about Chapter 2 in our textbook, Globalization, the Making of World Society, written by Frank Lechner. Lechner is a good writer and writes a very entertaining book, and he uses a lot of stories to get his points across, and Chapter 2 is no exception. Chapter 2 is quite an entertaining chapter because he talks about the globalization of food, and I'm going to have a lot to reflect on with respect to his technique in tracing the history of globalization, and also about the globalization of food, because we're going to talk a lot about contemporary food issues once we've kind of moved past the history aspects. I'm not summarizing the chapter for the test here with this video, just to let you know that. What I'm doing is covering some high points of the chapter, but material that could be on the test could be from anything that's written in the chapter, so you need to read the chapter. This lecture does not substitute for reading Chapter 2 in Globalization by Lechner. Okay, so let's first start with what Lechner says about globalization in the sense of definitions. He first and correctly identifies globalization using the example of the global sushi market. And I love sushi, so this is great for me. So definitionally, he has identified 4 criteria for globalization, and these are diffusion, interdependence, organization, and culture/consciousness. And for the global sushi market, what does this mean? We can just sort of point to that market and say, well, for diffusion, what are we talking about for global sushi? And I'm going to go on a limb here and say that what we're talking about is post-World War II awareness of Japanese culture and the existence of Japanese cuisine, particularly as it accelerated in the late 60s, the 70s, and the 80s. In the last century, you saw increasing rates of diffusion and knowledge, consumer awareness of the possibilities of Japanese cuisine. And then we see interdependence, and this is more of a behind-the-scenes supply side. Diffusion is typically more of a demand side aspect, and then you have interdependence, more of a supply side story, where you've got these fish markets, particularly the very large one near Tokyo that he talks about, whose name I'm really not able to pronounce very well. That one is now kind of the strategic center for hundreds of fish markets around the world, and thousands of fishermen and fishing companies and fisheries all over the world. And it all comes together there, but there's mutual interdependence among all those parties, kind of coordinated at the strategic center in Japan. And then you have organization, and for the organization of the global sushi market, I'm going to point to the rise of communications and logistics capabilities in our infrastructure. In particular, the way that we bring boats in to docks, and we handle the fish, and that the fish are stored and transported off the boats and to various places. Many of the fish they discuss are taken by air to a number of locations globally. So again, communications and logistics, those are the crucial organizational elements for the success of the global sushi market. And then finally, culture/consciousness, and this connects a little bit back to diffusion, but it's without the sort of spreading it out side of diffusion. It's more saying, well, how have consumer tastes evolved? And some would say that the defeat of Japan in World War II was actually not so bad for their society, in the sense that it opened them up to a society that was reconstructed, that was very capitalistic in its nature and very democratic in its nature, although the Japanese put a unique cultural spin on capitalism and democracy post-World War II. What you see is their culture absorbed a lot of Western culture, and then Western culture absorbed a huge amount of Japanese culture in the form of our consumer tastes changed. Now, moving from that example, which gives you the definition, an example of applying the definition of the criteria for globalization, moving from that to the text of the chapter briefly, I'm going to now come here to Module 2 here and just briefly summarize the chapter. And I'm not going to summarize every detail of the chapter. That's for you to read. But let's look at it this way. From here over, you have Lechner talking about 3 waves of globalization in the food industry, essentially from 1571 or 1670, depending on who you believe, and Lechner says it's controversial, which is sort of the, quote, start of globalization, to about 1865, which he doesn't say, but which I'm telling you, that's the when we eliminated slavery and we amended the Constitution of the United States to eliminate slavery. At that point, that was the end of the first wave. The first wave example that he uses during this period, and let's say 1571 to 1865, it's a long time, almost 300 years. The example he uses is sugar, and where is in Jamaica. And what is the role of the state in this? And it's heavy. Everything is for the sovereigns. The profits go to the sovereigns of England in this case. And this is the beginning of a sugar industry that is an example of early globalization, where the sugar is going to England and the sugar is going to continental Europe, and the labor is being provided by Africans, and the growing is being done in the Mediterranean. So again, 1571 to 1865. Now, wave 2, which maybe it's a little closer to recent history, so it's easier to relate to, is from 1875 to 1970, and that's the railroads and wheat. And the wheat is the food aspect of this, but the notion is that North Dakota, whose population grew more than tenfold during this period, during the first 40 years of this period, population grew tenfold because of the presence of the railroads and the major importance of North Dakota as a through point for railroads that were terminating there and also going further west. There was huge economic growth there. This part of the country was a good place to grow wheat. So you started to see now the industrialization, the fervent industrialization of agriculture, the sense that the Industrial Revolution, which permitted the building of the railroads, those techniques might be applicable to agriculture, was starting to take hold. And so you see millions of acres of wheat being grown by the time you're in the later part of this period. What is the role of the state here? It's lesser. Who's getting all the profits? That's another way to look at what is the role of the state. And certainly I've written down here robber barons, which is what they wanted to call Stanford's mascot. Leland Stanford was one of the robber barons. He was involved. He owned much of the railroads in California at one time, almost all of them. And this created a lot of wealth because there were people and goods to go on the railroads. But I think more than that, the idea of applying the industrial elements of the railroads to the wheat growing and then using the railroads to transport the wheat subsequently was huge and had tremendous impact for wave 2 of globalization. And this wheat was exported all over the world. We sent wheat everywhere, but again, particularly to our largest trading partners during this period, which had to be, again, Western Europe. Okay, now on to a more familiar period of time, wave 3 of globalization of food, which roughly we call 1971 to the present, and the example that Lechner uses is McDonald's. Okay, and where the locations we see initially wave 1, Jamaica, wave 2, North Dakota, and the Great Plains states of the US, and then here wave 3, prosperous growth countries. It's not just the US anymore. We're looking at this globalization reaching more deliberately, not in an ad hoc manner, out into the world and saying we're going to reap profits. And now what is the role of the state is absolutely minimized, and the corporate entities, not the robber barons anymore, which is essentially individuals, but the corporate entities, shareholders, CEOs, majority shareholders, they're reaping all the profits here. And now this is where Lechner stops, wave 1, 2, 3, and then he starts to identify similarities across the waves. Okay, and again, wave 1 was sugar, wave 2 is wheat, wave 3 is McDonald's, and where increasingly global locations. But now we have to ask, did Lechner stop too soon? Is there a wave 4? What's going on in the present to the future? This is my reflection on Lechner here. And I think we could take an example of smartphones and networks, and we could say where, and all of a sudden it's not prosperous growth countries anymore, it's just everywhere. The networks are ubiquitous, the smartphones are becoming ubiquitous, so we're starting to see much more wide diffusion effects of the technologies globally, and it's much more rapid. And then what is the role of the state and who's benefiting? you could say it's a little bit chaotic right now, or you could say it's sort of corporate entities plus individual independent entrepreneurs, but we don't know. So I've got a question mark there. I've written chaos with a question mark here. And so that's a little bit the summary that we can extract some of the major meaning from the historical part of the chapter. Let me turn here now to section 3, because I think it's worthwhile to identify one important pattern. I'm not saying Lechner missed this, but as he's going through, I think that this is something that he may have neglected to go deep into, and that is, let's ask the question not so much in terms of pattern of economics, but patterns of oppressed people. Who got oppressed in what wave? Okay, first wave, again, 1571 or 1670 to 1865, clearly slaves from Africa. That's the oppressed, and that's the source of labor for all the sugar. It was very hard, as the book notes, as Lechner notes, to actually raise a family in Jamaica if you were a slave family, so children died very young, and the solution to that, solution in quotes, was to import more slaves, more adolescent slaves from Africa, or young adult slaves from Africa, and just let the children die. So the rate of importation of slaves into Jamaica, given the size and population of Jamaica, is obscenely large, because the notion was that there was no support and no desire to give support to the families of slaves or to the raising of slaves in Jamaica, because that was expensive, and you could just go to Africa and bring fully grown slaves over. Very dark time as we look back on this in perspective. Second wave, the railroads were built on the backs of the Chinese immigrants in the U.S. And so this is clearly the oppressed minority at this time in the U.S., the 1875 to 1970 period, in terms of the context that we're talking about, which is the railroads, the growth of wheat. You could also say that there was continuing oppression of African Americans at that time, which I think is absolutely correct. But I'm specifically looking at the context of the railroads and the industrialization of wheat. Third wave, harder question: who are the oppressed people, or who is becoming oppressed, or who is suffering? The health of United States kids. The perception of McDonald's as evil. One of the problems using McDonald's as an example, and many textbooks use McDonald's as an example, is that we have to ask the question at the end of the day: is McDonald's really evil? Was the industrialization of food such a good idea? In other words, was taking these industrialization techniques regarding railroads and wheat and this ability to industrially grow and develop food and translating it into a restaurant business, was that a good idea? And engineering all the humanity out of making hamburgers, was that a good idea? And as far as impact on health of U.S. kids, it's very easy and reasonable to interpret McDonald's as kind of having an evil component. We could also say that, kind of turning it the other way and looking outside, neglected emerging economies for the third wave. In other words, we have neglected to feed these people in places like Sudan and many North African countries and Central African countries. Does everyone suffer? Is the whole population worse off because of the rise of the industrialization of food, the globalization of food? Or is it confined to middle classes everywhere? Middle classes in Europe, middle classes in Eastern Europe, middle classes in the Mideast, middle class in the US, middle class in Latin America. Is that who we're talking about, who's primarily suffering? We have to really ask these questions. Clearly, at the end of this chain of waves, we don't have a series of really wonderful positive outcomes at the moment, but I'm going to talk about signs of hope soon. So having covered item 3 here, we're going to move over to item 4, which is my sense of what are the key points of the chapter. Again, without going into the details of the chapter, clearly, I think he mentions it a couple times, that Lechner is concerned about the effects of globalization on the physical world. And for example, he's talking about farms, plants, roads, the construction of roads, the emissions that result from vehicles driving on these roads. These things physically alter our world, which is our whole universe, really, for humans at the moment. And the sense of a lack of awareness of that, of how does McDonald's, being one of the largest landowners in the world, because they own most of the land on which their restaurants are built, how does McDonald's deal with managing all this land, all this physical land? What is the impact on the physical environment of multiple millions of square feet or square meters of real estate that is basically all concrete, that's generating a fair amount of toxic waste on a per site basis? How does that have an impact on our world? How has McDonald's changed farming? And McDonald's has changed farming in huge ways by subsidizing farmers to grow the potatoes that they can use in the French fries, for example. On the other hand, to their credit, McDonald's tends to source locally. So we can say, look at that. This is not the dump on McDonald's lecture. Is McDonald's the perfect example reflection? And we can say some good things about McDonald's. One is that they've trained a lot of farmers in really high quality farming techniques that they can use to feed people in their country. Okay. Another key point is that the three waves echo each other, so that these three waves all can be kind of organized and compared with each other, and you can learn something from that. You can get insights from that. Third point, globalization has most dramatically occurred over the last 500 years. Kind of obvious, but it's also still a very important point to make, is that in 500 years we've come this huge amount of distance as far as our technology goes and as far as our ability to change ourselves. And then dropping back up to the first point, our ability to change our world has dramatically increased. And finally, food is clearly a very globalized product, but, and this is to Lechner's credit, he recognizes that there's a lot of mixing of the global and the local going on. And I'm going to give you an example of that, a personal example of that, a little bit later. But this is absolutely true that the truth is, although it's a pretty globalized world and food is a pretty good example of a globalized industry product area, there's absolutely a lot of mixing of global and local going on. And in an effort to kind of understand what does it mean to mix global and local, what does it mean when we emphasize one or the other or both, what are the implications of that, I want to turn to a framework, because we've talked about a lot of data and a lot of facts and a lot of points and a lot of assertions, but how do we organize our thinking? How can we really make something of this chapter to kind of organize it and give it, I think most importantly, some context. Let's add that here. Let's call this context. It's hugely important, and the context section is item number 5 here, and we want to organize our thinking. That's really key, and for that we use a framework to get some perspective, and we're going to use a specific framework from an older book called Multinational Mission by a couple guys named Prahalad and Dose, pretty smart guys. The book was published in 1985, still a pretty relevant book. And we're going to look at a two-dimensional graph. This is not a math class, but we do use these XY plots occasionally in here, and we try to make them really comprehensible. So we have a vertical axis here with, on this axis we have the drive to globally integrate. And you can have a minus that's less or a plus that's more. So down here would be a very low drive to globally integrate, and up here would be a very high drive to globally integrate. And on the x-axis, if you will, we have low to high, need to be locally responsive, which is a little easier to understand than the global integration. And let me just go through a few examples. Let's start with food, because we've been talking about food. And I'm going to talk about, my writing is terrible, but hopefully we can see this on the video. Let's talk about packaged food, okay? Stuff like cereal and rice-a-roni and hamburger helper. I'm giving all American examples. Prepackaged soup. That would be another good example, okay? So for packaged food, there's a very big need to be locally responsive. The food has to be packaged in compliance with local food packaging regulations in different countries. It has to be in the correct language so people in a particular country can understand what they're getting and what they're buying. So that's a very strong need to be locally responsive. And at the same time, in order for firms selling packaged food to be competitive in a global market, they have to globally integrate their supply chain. And also, that's every aspect of their supply chain all the way out to distribution, from sourcing the raw materials all the way out to distribution and selling. So the result is you have very high drive to globally integrate, and that's mostly for cost purposes, to keep the costs of raw materials and logistics, for example, down. And then also you have to be locally responsive. You're going to sell food to the locals because food is important to people. Food is centered around culture. It's not just generic. Everybody can't eat just the same thing all the time. Or let's say everybody doesn't eat everything just the same time. So we have packaged food is way up high on drive to globally integrate and need to be locally responsive. Let's talk about another food category. Let's talk about fresh fruit. Okay, fresh fruit, substantially lower drive to globally integrate because fruit is traditionally a very localized business, and it has been in the past tricky to transport fruit globally because of spoilage issues and preservation issues, refrigeration sometimes. But it seems like many of those problems have recently been solved. So now fruit, although it's sort of at medium high on the need to be locally responsive, people in California want their oranges, we could say that. That's the local responsiveness. We want navel oranges here. They're easy to peel, they're sweet, okay? That's our local responsiveness. And then, but the drive to globally integrate, it seems that there are in fact global markets for California oranges, for example, and we can transport them without spoilage, we can preserve them. So the drive to globally integrate goes up because the opportunity to make profits is going up too. So increase because of market expansion. You could sell more oranges, grow more oranges, sell more oranges if you globally integrate, especially your distribution infrastructure. So that's the two examples kind of from this lecture, but let's contextualize. Let's continue to talk about this in terms of some other industries that are not related to the food industry. And I'm going to jump over here to the top left corner where it's very high drive to globally integrate and almost zero need to be locally responsive. No need to be locally responsive in semiconductors, the chips that go in laptops and that go in smartphones and all phones now. These are very generic products in the sense that you don't need, a chip doesn't need to be written in Hungarian or in Spanish or Portuguese. A chip is a chip. And so you manufacture these and you send them all over the world and people put them in their products all over the world. And so they're very generic products. Even though Intel has been more successful than any other company with its very famous, now legendary Intel Inside advertising campaign, the notion here is that semiconductors are in fact a generic product. They're not that exciting. Intel has done a good job with the marketing, but that doesn't change their position on this plot. Let's talk about a couple of other more boring products. Carpet, toilet paper, lower need to globally integrate, but still pretty high relative to a lot of stuff, and very little need to be locally responsive. I got some carpet right here. This is carpet, okay? And I can hold this carpet up for you. And it's actually a rug, but you know what I'm talking about. This rug could be available in the Netherlands. This rug could be available in Russia. This rug could be available in Saudi Arabia or Italy or Japan. And people really wouldn't give it a second thought. So this is really a globally integrated business. Toilet paper, I don't need to go into too much detail on the applications, but you get the idea. Again, it's a very generic usage there, and so not much need to be locally responsive. We can look at phones, and here I'm really talking about handheld smartphones or cell phones, if you will. And there, again, we have very low need to be locally responsive, but a little bit more than semiconductors and carpet because you have to localize for the languages. So there's a little more need to be locally responsive. You could even argue that maybe that one should be over here, a little bit farther over. The phone's maybe not there. But and the need to globally integrate is just increasing and increasing and increasing with phones. So that the phones tend to really they're on the path to becoming ultra generic. Okay, despite some local adaptation, there's a limit to that. Once you've gotten into Portuguese, you're all set, and then you can continue on the path to globally integrate, to drive costs down, to source your phone parts and your assembly and your packaging from the least expensive countries possible, and then to source your logistics smartly and your distribution. So the drive to globally integrate is only increasing there. Clothing is another one. Clothing, like my shirt, for example. This is a shirt that happens to be made in China, an inexpensive shirt, and it used to be that clothing was very locally responsive to local trends, and it's gone this way a lot. So there's increasing need for local responsiveness, but also a big drive to globally integrate. So clothing has kind of moved up in this direction. The global integration is supply chain driven. Companies like Inditex, H&M, Uniqlo. These are fast fashion firms, and they all are highly globally integrated, and they are the most successful clothing firms in the world right now. So many other firms are following their leads. Inditex is, by the way, they own the Zara brand. They're a Spanish company, for those who don't know about them. We can look at some other companies that are kind of on the path. They're still down here, but quickly moving in this direction. Ruka, which is a Finnish company. Helly Hansen, which some of you may have actually heard of because they've decided to embark on a globalization path. Helly Hansen is a Swedish brand, I believe, of clothing. And they make rugged outdoor clothing. Okay, so moving from clothing, home building. Good. I needed to have an example down in the bottom right. I got lots going on up here in the global integration. Home building is a very locally responsive business down to the materials. This house is made of wood, okay? And it's lightly built. The temperature here in California is mild. Come visit us sometime in California, not my house. And you can see that the house is built accordingly, and it matches the weather patterns. And also there's a certain style. This is a modernist home, so it's got a flat roof and a lot of right angles in it. And so home building has tended to be very, very highly locally responsive and not very globally integrated at all, because it's responsive to local cultural needs and local environmental conditions. Possible exceptions, and I've written this in my typically unreadable writing, possible future exceptions would be prefabs. So you're already seeing the growth of the sales of freestanding prefabricated extra rooms or saunas or garden rooms or sunrooms, and this seems to be an exception. It's not exactly home building. It's more like adding to an existing home or adding to an existing property. But I can see the day when these prefab sales of, you can buy a freestanding sauna or a freestanding sunroom, that becomes you can buy a freestanding small home. I don't see that to be a big leap there. The local building codes are always going to be an issue, but I think there's a lot of potential there for home building to move in a globally integrated direction. I think it would be good for everybody if that were to happen, in fact, because homes would become more affordable as we got more generic parts on them. So, having talked about kind of this perspective about where is the food story versus some other industries, and I skipped PCs because we already did enough up here. So I'm going to switch now to some critical reflections regarding the chapter, and I'm doing this to sort of give you an example of what's a good critical reflection, because some of your assignments in this class relate to disagreeing with the book. Just find something that you disagree with in the book and support that convincingly. I'm going to give you some example critiques of Chapter 2. So one critique is that Lechner uses this wave approach to defining and understanding the globalization of the food industry, but maybe it's actually more true that the action that we're seeing here may be very ad hoc and random. So that it's just, and he's just seeing something where there isn't something to see really, and he's kind of making it up as he goes. I think he's actually got a little more on the ball than that, and he's really seeing an actual pattern, but he's attributing a lot of the motivation to culture and other kind of soft stories and not economic impulses. So if we look at this as solely driven by self-interest, individual self-interest for your family, then everything else is collateral damage. For example, the oppression of people, which we talked about, that's just something that happened because somebody was self-interested. Same with pollution. You manufacture canned tomatoes in Portugal and you ship them to the U.S. and you don't worry about the effect of the pollution in Portugal around the tomato canning plant. And so this is the collateral damage that doesn't matter as long as somebody's self-interest is being met. And so this is something he ignores here. And again, the critique is really, aren't you ignoring the fact that just everything is driven by self-interested economic impulses? So a second critique is, and I touched on this when I talked about McDonald's, is does the chapter assume somehow that the global food system is actually good? Is it somehow good? Okay, and should we look at McDonald's and say it's an excellent example of management of globalization, but it's a bad example of good capitalism? In other words, gee, we wish they had globalized on something a lot healthier than greasy hamburgers, where beef is in the food chain, and there's a lot of issues around how the animals are treated and how the food is processed and the health effects of that processing of the food on the consumers. So again, is McDonald's a bad example of good capitalism, and is even the the industrialization and globalization of the wheat business, is that again a bad example of good capitalism, and is the sugar trade a bad example of good capitalism? And what kind of positive messages can we take forward from this chapter regarding globalization, and specifically the globalization of food? Not sure. Okay, final critique point, then we're going to do something fun. Maybe Lechner ignores also the growing backlash in at least the US, and I've seen it in Europe too, in Western Europe for sure, and to some extent in Eastern Europe, and to some extent in Asia. I've witnessed the growing backlash against the industrialization and the globalization of food. And here we have the phenomenon of foodies, which is a term for people who love food. We use that term in the US. But this is a term this applies to people in China too. This applies to people in Japan. It's the slow food movement, which you may have heard of also, where the idea is to locally source as much food as possible and to take your time eating. It's not about eating to live, it's about living to eat, to mangle a phrase. And then finally, I'm going to show you an example of some exceptions, while also showing you an example of how amazingly globalized the current supply chain is for food. So we're going to actually adjourn now, and we're going to reassemble back in my kitchen, and we're going to talk a little bit about what just happens to be in my kitchen on a day-to-day basis. And so I hope you've enjoyed my whiteboard talk, and I'll be back with you in a few seconds. Thanks.